the amazing contributions that we've received, not being part of the EU, from the GRC for 5 years, actually 6 almost. For me, it's great to be here. First, because it seems to be a sharing of experiences of partners in crime, if you like, people who produce and use composite indicators. The meetings that I, often travel to either devote users of our index, or there are certain corners, of course, which are highly against such composite indices, and I think what we're having today is a more constructive approach. I will also try to provide a little bit the perspective from a non-EU organization, because we are part of the UN. And I would argue that the challenges in constructing these composite indicators, but also potentially the rewards, are amplified. Challenges because obviously in terms of data availability, you can figure that if you have trouble, then low-income countries will also have trouble. But in terms of rewards, obviously there is a massive resource investment within the EU in producing data in these things and creating even competing composite indicators at times. That is not the case in many middle-income, low-income countries. So often this is the only tool. So I just want to speak a little bit about the vision behind the GII, which is quite similar to other innovation indices we've heard about, the making of, and show some results in the little time I have available. Now, I think that in the EU and most developed countries, and also in many developing countries now, we're past the stage of having to argue that innovation is a critical component of anything and an important contributor to growth. So we've actually achieved that. It's a great achievement as compared to maybe 5-10 years ago. What is much more difficult now that policymakers have this awareness is to come up with the right indicators to measure and benchmark countries against one another. One of the visions of having a composite indicator on this one is to exactly move beyond one-dimensional metrics. The biggest the people that criticize these composite indices the most, certain economists, for instance, they turn around and use R&D expenditures or patents, even worse maybe, as ultimate innovation metric. So you always, when you look at these composite indicators, I think we have to keep the counterfactual in mind. What do people use when not resorting to such thing? And then, obviously, it's also to capture and mobilize policymakers' attention. Now, the GII has had quite a large impact and uptake, launched by the UN Secretary General in 2013 at the B20 G20 in Australia last year. But we figure that this comes with a lot of opportunities, but also with a lot of responsibility, right? So when we communicate results and when we do the write-ups, we try to be as careful as possible and in giving advice to the countries beyond the rankings as such on how to use these. It's very much a tool for action. I like the word of appetizer. We consider it an appetizer. We wouldn't suggest running with the GII on its own, but usually, and I'll talk about it later, accompany member states, from the appetizer to the dessert potentially. Now, this doesn't need a lot of explaining because I think we talked about most of this already. So there's no magic formula for measuring innovation, none at all. Of course, there's certain definitions, and I as ex-OECD know, of course, the Oslo definition, but is that a fully comprehensive one? We can debate this, and certainly there is no one metric that comes with it. So when we concoct this index, we look to measuring innovation environments and outputs. Those are the two ambits. And we face various challenges. This is the right data selection, the right scaling, often the right aggregation. And then one which we face in particular is whether to keep the model constant or to continually adapt. I don't know if you have the same experiences on this front, but given that we know that our innovation model suffers from missing and lacking perfect data, and that data is continuously developing, we feel that we need to adapt, and as soon as better data is available, we use it. We also think that innovation as such is changing. We heard the word big data. You could talk about open science. These are terms and concepts that maybe we didn't discuss 15 years ago. So we think it's necessary to have a measured degree of adaptation. This is the structure of the GII. So similarly to the other indices, we structure it into input and output metrics, where we have about 80 indicators. And one of the struggles, obviously, is to have good data coverage for these 80 indicators for about 140 countries. And again, as if you find it difficult for the EU member states, then imagine what it is for a larger cross set. I'm facing, for instance, this year, the decision: should we be tougher on the data criteria and exclude countries which don't, be slightly more strict, so countries which don't have 70% of all the data, we exclude them, or whether we should retain them. And it's a careful balancing. This country is not going to be Belgium that I will exclude, but it's most likely, Syria, Togo, or this sort of country. Now, and then there's a careful political balancing act, whether excluding it does more harm than actually keeping it in terms of the policy ramifications. Now, we thanks to the GRC and the 5-year cooperation, we go through strategies to ensure the robustness. I will not repeat those because they are the same as in the other presentations. Importantly, GRC for us has been an important sparring partner, because when we include and exclude variables in this journey to better measurement, we often seek advice from the team. So what the GII is very good about, we think, is in terms of benchmarking the relative performance of countries in a given year, and then to analyze the national innovation system. That is what we wanted, and it was predictable. What we didn't predict, and I'm not sure it's so relevant to EU, but I found that it has been an extremely powerful tool to incentivize these low and middle income countries to collect data. Okay, so I have been in many meetings where there is the minister, the chief statistician, and so forth. In Costa Rica is one example, or Egypt, where I show all the missing data that is available on these indicators we need, and then the minister turns around to the chief statistician and says, you better start submitting data to the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, otherwise, I might be slightly mad at you next year. And it has quite a powerful impact. It also has an impact on on data in new fields. Okay, and this is a slower process. So, for instance, everybody's talking about user-created innovation, right? This is a big theme. Now, you ask me what indicators you could use in the OECD. I would not have a good idea. So we try to find proxies for that, and we try to spur the statistical community to potentially come up with better ones. So you can't do this for 80 policy fields, but for 1 or 2 each and every 2 and 3 years, that actually has worked quite well. Obviously, we then produce rankings. This is what attracts the attention, and then is the the entry point. More than the ranking was just really interesting is if you position the country against, for instance, its peers with a similar level of development. And this is what this bubble chart, for instance, does by comparing the innovation score against, for instance, the level of development of countries. And in the same way, you can actually quite neatly identify core weaknesses and strengths of countries. You can then also pick up particular regions and and highlight and give kudos, if you like, to particular outperformers relative to development, which then also has often a very nice positive impact on the policy side. I will skip a few slides here. We also do tend to experiment. So I think there's broad recognition now that innovation is not only about big numbers, so just having more patents, just having more R&D expenditures, but that you also need to go beyond this numbers game and look at the quality of innovation. And so we have been creating for a while now and experimenting with some sort of a sub-index in innovation quality, as represented here, and this is also work in progress mostly. Now the GII is used quite widely now within the UN system, so CERN, the ITU Secretary General and others are part of this, and we are in discussion in the SDG context also whether this can be used, yes or no, in the bazaar, how it was called earlier on. More impactful are these national innovation roundtables, which we then attend to. And so the best experiences that I've seen, I've been in, for instance, there was one meeting recently with the Prime Minister's office in Japan, but similar meetings also in Brazil, in Sri Lanka, Morocco, etc., is where you use this index as a starting point in a given country with the stakeholders, the statisticians, and often the minister that usually does help. You identify missing data points and opportunities. With opportunities, I mean how to leverage strengths, relative strengths, and overcome certain relative weaknesses. Then an action plan is composed, and again, remember, they don't have the commission often to structure an action plan for them, etc. So it's often an action plan which is united to the national innovation strategy, and in the best of all worlds, we go back to monitor and assess results after some time. So this is the last slide, slightly off here, but so it has seen wide uptake and impact, the GII. That comes with a lot of responsibility and the need for caution. Thanks again to the GRC for making a meaningful contribution, not only to statistics but innovation policy, and I look forward to your comments and further learning from your experiences. Thank you.